Today's text comes from Exodus chapter 14, verses 10 through 18. As Pharaoh drew near, the Israelites looked back, and there were the Egyptians advancing on them. In great fear, the Israelites cried out. They said to Moses, "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? What have you done to us, bringing us out of Egypt? Is this not the very thing that we told you in Egypt? Let us alone and let us serve the Egyptians. For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness." But Moses said to the people, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm and see the deliverance that the Lord will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall never see again. The Lord will fight for you, and you have only to keep still." Then the Lord said to Moses, "Why do you cry out to me? Tell the Israelites to go forward, but you lift up your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea and divide it, that the Israelites may go into the sea on dry ground. Then I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians so that they will go after them. And so I will gain glory for myself over Pharaoh and all his armies, his chariots and his chariot drivers. And the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord, when I have gained glory for myself over Pharaoh, his chariots, and his drivers." The word of the Lord. This text is a fairly popular text. It's part of the Exodus story of Israel leaving Egypt. And there are so many things happening in just this short text that we read today. I wanted to get us up to speed on how we got here. Many of us, or most of us, have seen movies or read scripture or heard stories about the Exodus. God was calling his people out of Egypt, out from under the oppressive regime and the slavery that was holding them captive. And God sent Moses, and Moses went in as God's voice, and 10 plagues came, and continuously the Pharaoh said no. Moses would come in and say, "Let my people go," and the Pharaoh would say no, and a plague would come, until finally the firstborn of all of those who were not Israelite perished, the final plague. And Pharaoh, after losing his son, finally says yes when Moses comes and says, "Let my people go." But then something happened. Even though he was like, finally, I think I need to let these people go from here, he realized that he was losing a whole community that was helping to build Egypt. And to get an idea of how big the community was, Philadelphia has about 1.5 million people, and it's one of the bigger cities in the U.S. According to Exodus 13, there were about 600,000 men in Israel. If 3/4 of those men were married, then there were over 1 million men and women. And if each of those couples had children, it can go into the millions. So the community wasn't a few people who he decided to let go. It was a city. If it existed today, it would be one of the bigger cities in the U.S. So this wasn't just a few people, and Moses wasn't just one of among a few hundred that decided to leave or wanted to go. It was millions. And Pharaoh, realizing this, after he had let them go, turned around and said, no, this can't be. And he went out sending a huge force behind them. And I don't think it was to bring them back at that point. At this point, he was angry of what had happened. Not only had his country come into chaos, he also had lost his firstborn. So you can imagine that Pharaoh was an emotional wreck. And realizing what was happening, he said, no, we're going to do something about this. And he couldn't just send one battalion or even one legion, he had to send a big army because there were 600,000 men in Israel. And a small army or a small battalion could have been defeated quickly. So he sends out his chariots and his army after them. And so now you have these people, the Israelites who have been slaves for 400 years, who were used to oppression, who were used to being told what to do, how to do it, what they can and can't have, how they can and can't do things. They were used to this. 400 years, that means it was generations of being told. And now here was their moment of freedom. But how difficult it is to accept the freedom that's before you. I think that the biggest thing they did, the hardest thing that the Israelites were able to do, was take that first step out. Everything else is easy compared to taking that first step. Because upon taking this first step out of Egypt, they were recognizing that their time there had ended. They were accepting the freedom that was coming with this step. They were taking the chance that this God whom they had proclaimed and prayed to was in fact opening the door and bringing them out. It all began with that first step. It's always the hardest step in our lives when we are pushed to do things, when we want to do things, when we want to accomplish something, when we're called to go out. It's not all the other steps. It's always that first step that's most vital. Because if you don't take that first steps, everything else after it doesn't come. How many times in your life have you been unwilling to take that first step? God opened the doors of Egypt. God showed power beyond like imagination to the Israelites and to the Egyptians. Things happened that just couldn't be explained in any other way than God was present. Things happened that couldn't be explained in any other way, even if you can explain it by science. It still took a higher power to put these things into context, into order, into happening when they happened and how they happened. It wasn't just a coincidence. God was present. They saw, they experienced, they felt. They were very present in that moment. And then we come to our text today, knowing that these people had just experienced God in a way that I think most of us would love to experience God, in a very real and tangible way. They saw God moving. They had a pillar of fire by night that led them. They had a pillar of smoke by day that continued to burn. They were able to follow because God was providing this. They saw all of the plagues. They heard all of the things. They saw the firstborns gone. They experienced God in a very real way. And when we get to our chapter today, as they're standing before a sea that is immovable, and they're standing behind them comes an army that is undefeated, what's the first thing they do? And fear at that moment is so real. So many times we can't see any rhyme or reason. We can't see beyond the fear that attacks us in a moment like this. Even though they saw, they experienced, they touched, they were part of God being present, the first thing they do is they turn to Moses and say, "Were there not enough graves in Egypt? What have you done?" They kind of forgot that they had been praying for this. What have you done bringing us out of Egypt. We told you to leave us alone. We would rather serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness. Now, when we think about that, when we see from a distance, we probably say, well, what's wrong with them? How could they? Look at all that God has done. They were there. They saw. They saw that it wasn't Moses who decided and said, let my people go. They saw that it was God who sent Moses. It was God who was moving. It was God who was in control. It was God who was freeing them. They saw it. They knew it. They understood it. But now when their backs are against the wall and terror is coming at them, their fear overwhelms them. And they can't look beyond that. They forgot that God was present. They forgot that it was God who was lighting the way, literally, for them. They forgot. And they always go back to, well, you should have just left us alone. It was better that we would have died there serving them. At least we would have had a place to be buried. At least we would have had some food. At least we wouldn't die out here in the middle of nowhere. At the very least. How many times has fear done that to our lives? Where fear has held us back. Where fear has held you back. Where fear has held me back from taking that first step to get out and go to where God is calling me. And then, even when trouble comes, even when my back is against the wall, rather than just seeing the moment of fear, looking beyond it and knowing that God is in control, how many of us have succumbed to that moment of fear? I'm afraid. I should have just stayed. I should have stayed comfortable. I should have just remained where I was. I shouldn't have come. I shouldn't have. How many times have we done that to ourselves? Even though we were sure when we left that it was God, what happened to that security, that knowledge, that trust in this moment of fear? I don't blame them. Fear does that to us. Fear blinds us. Fear prevents us from seeing more than what's before us. Fear is the human instinct that has allowed us to continue to survive the fight or flight. But yet, fear is also the very thing that keeps us where we are. Because as humans, we tend to get comfortable wherever we may be. There may be a situation that's not good for us, a job, a home life, or something else. And yet, because we know that this situation is not good for us, we get comfortable in it. I'm afraid to go try something new because I don't know that. But I know this. Even though this is uncomfortable, even though I hate this, even though I don't want to be here, even though we are great at rationalizing. We are and would rather stay in the stuff that we know than to take a risk and take that first step into something that we don't know. And we know that the unknown is scary. But the unknown is unknown because we haven't risked and taken the first steps to get there. Mr. Rogers said that a stranger is a friend that you haven't met yet. I say that the unknown is a place that you haven't been to yet. But once you get there, it's no longer unknown. When you take that step and leave that job that's causing you so much, that's giving you an ulcer, that's causing you migraines, that's causing you to suffer, that's preventing you from living your life, and move into something where God is calling you or where you feel so much better. It's not until you take that first step out that you realize the unknown wasn't as scary as you thought it was. And that's what Moses does. Moses hears their cry. And often what we do as people, when somebody comes at us and says, why did you do this? We react and we fight back. I didn't do anything. I didn't make you come. I didn't make you leave Egypt. He didn't go into that. He realized what was happening. He realized what they were reacting to. He realized that it wasn't him, but it was the situation, and it was fear that was blinding them. So even though they were attacking him, he didn't fight back. Instead, he said, do not be afraid. Stand firm. Deliverance is coming. And these Egyptians that you see today, you will never see them again. And then he says something that I think is probably the most difficult thing to do. Be still and let God fight for you. Be still. The Lord will fight for you. You have only to be still. Now, I don't know about you all. I have trouble being still. And if there's something that I can react to, chances are I will react to it. And even if I'm able to see beyond what somebody is saying and know that it's not personal to me, I still want to do something to make it better. If I can stand up and fight for them, if I can help them, pull them out of whatever it is, I want to do that. But sometimes the best thing to do is to be still and let God fight for you. And most times, the most difficult thing to do is to be still and let God fight for you. And all of this is happening. The Egyptians are coming. The sea is before them. They're terrified. Moses is trying to calm them. And then Moses comes to God. All of this stuff is happening. So Moses is like, what am I supposed to do? God, tell me what needs to be done. And God says, why do you cry out to me? Tell the Israelites to go forward, but you lift up your staff and stretch out your hand over that sea and divide it. So all of this is happening in the midst of this crazy, chaotic stuff. An army is coming. Your back is to the wall. In this case, their backs are to the ocean or to the sea. An army is coming at them. They may have weapons, but they're not really military persons. There's also a million kids and women and all these things happening. How do we react? And God says, be still. And then he says, why are you crying out to me? Sometimes we know what needs to be done. Sometimes we've already prayed, or quite often we've prayed about all the things that need to be done. We've prayed that God open our hearts and minds. We prayed already. But yet we continue rather than doing what needs to be done. It's a call to action. It's a call to do. It's a call to move forward. It's a call that it's time. And we know that. I'm guilty of this just as much as everyone else. Keep praying for the same thing, even though God has opened the door, even though God has let us know, even though God has said and everyone has confirmed and everything is leading to this direction. Well, I got to pray some more. And part of that is fear. We may not be displaying it in the way that the Israelites were by attacking Moses, but we're using prayer as a crutch because we don't want to take the action that's necessary. The action that we know is already time to take. Every time there's a mass shooting, people send thoughts and prayers. Thoughts and prayers are no longer cutting it. It doesn't do the job. It's time for action. It's time for change. In our lives, we keep asking for prayer and we keep trying to pray, but the thing that is before us, we already know. It's time to take action. It's time to do. It's time to stop laying back, and it's time to stop waiting. The time for action has come. God says, why are you crying out to me? It's time to move forward. This ocean before you is nothing. Put out your staff and go. And Moses lifts his staff, and the ocean starts to open before him. So I tell you today, it's time to stop letting fear rule your life. It's time to stop being blinded by the things that you are afraid of. It's time to stop allowing God to just be put to the side because you're afraid. It's time to stop putting your blessing to the side because you're afraid. It's time to look beyond the fear. It's time to move beyond the fear. It's time not for meditation and prayer, but for action. You have to move beyond the fear. You have to move beyond that which you are afraid of. You have to go before it, face it, confront it, move it aside, and keep moving forward. That Red Sea may be before you, but the staff is in your hands. That wall may be trying to block you, but God has called you to action. Fear may be trying to hold you back. There might be an army behind you and an ocean before you, but God has given you the power to open that sea, and it's time. It's time for action. It's time to start moving forward. It's time to lift up your staff and move forward. Fear will keep you where you are, and comfort will keep you from moving forward. But it's time to stop complaining. It's time to stop whining. It's time to stop worrying about what could go wrong or will go wrong. For we know in life things go wrong. We know that. It's time for action. It's time to do. It's time to lift up your staff so that God can open that sea before you and you can start your way to God's promised land for you. It's time for action.